Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you today to our educational webinar on an overview of coverage analysis. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to our site network members after the broadcast on our site network web portal. Today, my name is Kim Jennings. I am the director of the Clinical Site Network for IACT for Children, and I will be your moderator. Just a couple of housekeeping tips to keep in mind today. To expand the control panel, simply click on the orange arrow in the top right-hand corner, and this will expand your control panel. And if you would like to ask questions, we ask that you type in your question and submit it through the questions section of your control panel. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And hopefully we will get to everybody's questions and answer them. However, if we run out of time today and we don't answer your question, we will respond to you via email after the webinar. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Our presenter today is Rebecca Mercado, who is the co-founder and clinical research manager of the Pediatric Research Hub for the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Florida. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. Is everyone able to hear me okay? All right, next slide, please. So before I begin, I do want to say thank you to Lisa and Kim, Fane, and Grace for giving me this opportunity to be able to share the knowledge that I have gained and also be able to represent the IACT network in this educational seminar. And I definitely want to make sure that I thank IACT for Children for doing the great work that they do and for bringing this community together. Next slide. So just a note, please make sure that you remember that this is strictly an overview. There's certainly not enough time in an hour presentation to review all of the depth of ins and outs related to coverage analysis, and recognizing that there might be differences based on your state or your institutional policies. So please use this as an educational tool. And hopefully this will spark conversation at your institution if it hasn't been brought up already. And then if you do have follow-up questions, my contact information will be available at the end, as well as some resources and tools that you may want to use if you're not using them already. Next. So today's learning objectives are going to be in brief overview. We're going to review the history of coverage analysis. We're going to define coverage analysis. We're going to define Medicare qualifying clinical trials and routine costs. We're going to describe the process of coverage analysis in a very broad stroke. And then we're also going to review considerations when performing coverage analysis. And again, please remember, these are going to be very broad, overarching strokes. And if you have different things that you might be doing at your institution that are a little bit more in depth, then please go with your institutional policies. Next. So where did it all begin? That's the question that I think is helpful in starting when we're looking at this topic of coverage analysis. Why is it important, and what's the purpose behind doing all of this? Well, prior to the year 2000, most insurance companies did not cover activities related to clinical trials. They said that there was an exception to their coverage because of the investigational nature of the treatments. And as we will learn, the burden of cost for clinical trials really fell on the families, and it fell on the individuals who were receiving treatment. And at this time, there were probably more clinical trials related to oncology where this became a larger financial burden, where that burden was able to be measured or discovered or seen in a way that was unique. And so it sort of brought to light this financial burden that was really making it disadvantaged for families to be able to access care. So in 2000, the National Coverage Decision was created, and it's called NCD 310.1. And what this action created was it allowed CMS beneficiaries to participate in qualifying clinical trials, and there is a definition for that, and we will review it. But it also enables CMS to reimburse providers and hospitals for routine costs performed as part of a qualifying clinical trial. So what does that mean? Approximately 1 in 5, oh, sorry, next. Approximately 1 in 5 Americans have insurance coverage through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This is important for us because children can also be funded through CMS through programs such as CHIP. And so knowing that the majority of our audience may fall into that under 18 category, knowing that CMS provides these coverages opens the door for private insurance as well. What we find is that Medicare tends to have the more restrictive rules, and so private insurance tends to follow whatever the federal funding or the federal agencies dictate. And so although many illnesses may not have a cure and/or an FDA-approved treatment, investigational treatments are frequently denied by insurance reimbursement, but because of this NCD, we're finding that more and more opportunities for insurance to help cover costs for qualifying clinical trials, those doors are continuing to open. Next. So now we're going to take a very short pop quiz. Next. All right, so to see who was listening, which US president executed the first legislation allowing clinical trial coverage for Medicare beneficiaries? Was it Harry Truman in 1946, John F. Kennedy in 1962, Bill Clinton in the year 2000, or Barack Obama in the year 2012? And I believe that there should be a poll. Yes. And so if you will please select the option, then I will wait and see what the responses are. And so Kim, do we know what the poll is showing?
Yeah, so about 86% noted Bill Clinton, 7% voted for Harry Truman, and 7% voted for John F. Kennedy.
Well, if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
So those of you who selected Bill Clinton in the year 2000 were correct. So Bill Clinton enacted the National Coverage Decision for Routine Costs in Clinical Trials, also known as NCD 310.1. This legislation outlines and defines what routine costs can be covered for with Medicare beneficiaries. And this is the first piece of legislation that enables clinical trial coverage for Medicare beneficiaries. So this was the very foundational piece of legislation that began to create the need for what we now know today as coverage analysis. Next slide. All right, so prior to the year 2000, who was responsible for covering the costs of participating in a clinical trial in the United States? Was it the study sponsor, health insurance, federal or state government, or study participants? I believe there'll be a poll showing here shortly for you to select. Do we have any results yet?
Yeah, so my apologies, my screen is not where it should be. There it goes. So 30% of the study were noted study sponsors, and 57% noted study participants, and 8% noted health insurance.
All right, so next slide. All right, so those of you who selected study participants were correct. So prior to the year 2000, relatively few sponsors paid for the costs associated with clinical trials. And if a patient needed treatment, then they often had to pay out of pocket. Interesting to note that the median household income in 1999 in the United States was approximately $42,000. However, I'm going to use the cancer cancer treatment as an example because this is where we have the most literature. Cancer treatments at that time could range as much as $30,000 per month. And implantable device trials at that time could be as much as $5,000 or more. And so just imagine what that financial burden would be to that family if they were able to receive a potentially life-saving clinical trial, but then had to deal with the financial repercussions of what that might mean. So in 2000, when the National Coverage Decision was created, it allowed Medicare, which their primary purpose is to provide basic health insurance, It allowed them to be able to cover costs associated with a clinical trial, which then began to open the door for private insurance companies to follow suit. Next. So what is coverage analysis? This is the wonderful question that we are here to help answer. Next. So coverage analysis really begins again with the legislation, with the national coverage decision that was created by President Bill Clinton in the year 2000. This decision enables CMS beneficiaries to participate in what is defined as a qualifying clinical trial. And that verbiage is very important, and we will be coming back to that definition very shortly. It enables CMS to reimburse providers and hospitals for routine costs. Again, we'll come back to that definition shortly. Those routine costs that are performed as part of a QCT. The federal clinical trial policy was enacted in 2007, and this was essentially an update to the NCD 310.1. And what this did is that it ensured that studies would meet the qualifying clinical trial definition, that it would create guidance for documentation of the study-related activities that are considered routine costs. And it also further elaborated on the CMS rules, which allow for specified routine costs to be reimbursed. And what that did is it helped create a better pathway. And for institutions, it helped create better definition and opportunity for institutions to be able to enact internal policies so that we can create coverage analysis plans for mitigating risk. Next slide. So coverage analysis in the most basic definition is an analysis of a financial review of a research study to determine, first, is it eligible to receive Medicare coverage? And second, what are the items or services performed as part of that research study that can be billed to Medicare? And the coverage analysis process will walk us through a handful of questions that have to be met. And if those questions are not met, then the study may or may not qualify for, may not be considered a Medicare qualifying clinical trial, and coverage analysis may not be needed. Now, I say that carefully because each institution may have a differing policy on what they require for all studies or just some studies, and what the depth or breadth of coverage analysis may be at that institution. So please make sure that if you're at an institution that you're familiar with the policies and procedures enacted at your university. Coverage analysis should be performed, and if you're doing it correctly, is performed in accordance with the national coverage decision and the federal clinical trials policy. That was the update in 2007. And then again, remember that there might be institutional policies that may also need to be applied. Next. So what is the purpose of coverage analysis? And again, its most simple thought process, it's to create a documented billing plan. And the reason for that would be to mitigate the risk of false claims. So just by example, in 2019, the Department of Justice performed recovery of over $3 billion in False Claims Act settlements. Not all of those were related to academic medical centers or universities performing clinical trials, but many of them were. And it wasn't because they were intentionally doing anything wrong. It was just that they did not have consistency or policies that were consistently being applied for how they were approaching coverage analysis and this process of creating billing designations that were clear. Even if the intention and the spirit behind how the billing plans may have been created, or even the documented actions and behaviors, if there was even a whiff or lack of a clarity in how the billing plan was to be executed, and during that auditing process, it was determined by Department of Justice that there was impropriety or opportunity for false claims, then the institution were penalized. And sometimes those penalties came because the institution raised their hand and said, hey, we're reading these guidelines and we have been interpreting them this way. And this is how we've been executing our coverage analysis. We're re-reviewing some of these updates, and we are concerned that we might be instituting them incorrectly. And so some of those False Claims Act settlements have actually come from the institution raising their hand and saying, I think we've done something that should be adjusted. Can you please review and confirm? And then, of course, the Department of Justice is more than happy to come in and review and confirm. But it also gives us the ability to be able to recognize what should and should not. Just because you can doesn't always mean that you should. And so it allows institutions to create their own boundaries around where they have risk and where they may want to draw the line to be able to be safe versus, hey, we want to kind of push the boundaries a little bit and interpret some of these guidelines perhaps a little more loosely or freely. Next. So again, thinking through what the process is, and knowing that coverage analysis by definition is as a financial review of the research study, and that part of the purpose is to create a billing plan and to mitigate risk of false claims. The steps that would be important to be able to execute when performing coverage analysis would be first and foremost determining if the study is a Medicare qualifying clinical trial. As you're going through that process and answering the questions, you would then want to document the study-related items or services considered routine costs. A coverage analysis should not only document the medical necessity, but it should also reference applicable guidance issued by Medicare. There should also be an opportunity to be able to clearly identify and be able to document what items or services are being paid for by the sponsor, what items or services might be considered a bundled service. And so if you're talking about an inpatient research study, it's possible that the patient is there for some unrelated reason, but they qualify for a clinical trial. And what are the activities that would be covered by the patient's insurance based solely on the fact that they're an inpatient stay? And what are the activities that would need to be covered by the research study because they might qualify for something? And we can potentially obtain some of that information from the chart based on whatever activities they might already be admitted for. And then what are the activities that might be above and beyond that the sponsor would need to cover? But trying to tease out some of that when you're looking at bundled services, it really does require a very careful and precise conversation to ensure that we're not double dipping, to ensure that things are itemized correctly, and also to ensure that there's clarity and consistency across studies, across sponsors, and even across units at the same institution, or if coverage analysis is being shared through a multi-center study, ensuring that the institutional policies at each location are being taken into consideration. Part of the billing plan should also include items provided without cost or monetary exchange. And so typically those are the items or things that the sponsor would be providing to the site. Or in some instances, it might be things that the site already has within their network, and they'll be using that particular item or service or device as part of the research study to be able to obtain the data or information that's necessary to complete the clinical trial. The coverage analysis should outline any applicable Medicare policy. This is really important, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. But as you're walking through this process, document, document, document. I cannot drill that home enough. It's very important to make sure that whatever decisions that are being made or clarifications that are required, that there is a documentation trail to be able to show the clarity and consistency of the plan. Next. All right, so we've been talking about this terminology, Medicare qualifying clinical trial, and what exactly does that mean? So CMS has this very nicely laid out on their website, and I would very strongly encourage you to go and actually read the NCD 310.1. But we'll begin with the definition provided by the National Coverage Decision and then updated by the Federal Clinical Trials Policy. Next. So the first part of the definition is that, and this language comes directly from their website, but the very first part of the definition states, the subject or purpose of the trial must be the evaluation of an item or service that falls within a Medicare benefit category. And examples that they provide are physician service, durable medical equipment, diagnostic test, and it is not statutorily excluded from coverage. And some of the examples that they provide here are cosmetic surgery and hearing aids. Next. The second part of this definition is that the trial must not be designed exclusively to test toxicity or disease pathophysiology. It must have therapeutic intent. And so the underlinings are mine to help drive home the key components that are important when we're looking at a Medicare qualifying clinical trial. Next. Part 3 is that the trials of therapeutic intervention must enroll patients with diagnosed disease rather than healthy volunteers. Trials of diagnostic interventions may enroll healthy participants in order to have a proper control group. And so typically with pediatrics, we will often be looking at studies that would enroll individuals that have a diagnosed disease. I have yet to experience a study that would be enrolling healthy volunteers, especially when it comes to younger children. And so more often than not, you would be seeing studies that would potentially qualify as a Medicare qualifying clinical trial when they when they're looking at children, but that can't uniformly be stated for all studies. And just because it can be allowed doesn't always mean that it will be allowed or should be allowed. And then also please bear in mind that even though the study may meet these 3 requirements, that according to CMS and according to the NCD-10 310.1, that these 3 requirements are not sufficient in and of themselves, that there are some additional considerations that they have listed to include certain characteristics of the study. It must fall into one of the benefits categories. And there's a very, very long list of what those benefit categories are. It's fairly robust. And then recognize that these areas can be updated. So it really is important to maintain consistency in updating internal guidelines and making sure that we're referencing the most current coverage decision paperwork. And in this case, it would be the updates to the website. Next. So routine costs. This is a term that we've heard. It's extremely important when considering the Medicare coverage analysis and the definitions that are provided by the National Coverage Decision and by the Federal Clinical Trials Policy. Routine costs, and again, this comes directly from the website, states that items or services that are typically provided absent a clinical trial. And so this is really important for us to make note of, is that routine costs are those types of activities that you would traditionally or routinely expect to see for treatment that would be considered standard of care or more conventional care for a patient that has a specific diagnosis. Items or services are required solely for the provision of the investigational item or service. And so that can include the administration of the IP. It would not include, of course, the IP itself, so the investigational product that should be provided by the sponsor. However, there are opportunities and allowances as routine costs for the administration of that study drug to be covered by insurance, as long as it's a Medicare qualifying clinical trial. And then additionally, items or services needed for reasonable and necessary care arising from the provision of investigational item or service, in particular for the diagnosis or treatment of complications. And this is one of those things that, again, you're going to want to talk with your institutional leadership, but there are allowances for serious adverse events or adverse events to potentially be covered by insurance. It absolutely needs to be a discussion that you would have with your leadership to determine what the allowances are or where the where the comfort may be. It would have to be part of the contract, and it has to be consistently applied across studies or situations, disease areas. But it is something that you may want to consider. How will the activities be covered? Who is going to be responsible for payment? And again, those would be activities or items that you would want to negotiate or talk through at the contracting level. But knowing that if it is a Medicare qualifying clinical trial, that there are allowances for some of those activities to be covered by patient insurance can certainly help, especially when you're looking at investigator-initiated studies or other activities where there may not be a lot of funding to help answer a particular research question or activity. Next. So one of the questions that I receive, well, what's the difference between routine cost and standard of care? There certainly can feel as if they are one and the same, but you do want to make sure that at your institution you have a clear definition, or at least a clear application of how those two terms are being utilized. So standard of care, think more along the lines of what you would do for a patient without them being on a research study. So what are the types of procedures, activities, orders that would be routinely or more consistently seen for a patient being treated for a specific disease? And if it does vary based on the clinician, we at our institution at least have started to rely on the use of our medical record to be able to see what are the behaviors or the orders, the activities that are more consistent for a specific disease group. Or we can break it down by physician, we can break it down by unit, and that will help us to be able to see where's the consistent pattern of behavior, where's the consistent pattern of ordering for certain things, so that we can help establish what would be considered standard of care. With pediatrics in particular, we do, at least at our institution, and I would expect other institutions are very similar. They might have a number of different subspecialties that they have clinicians where patients will come for treatment for certain rare disease. Very frequently establish behavior across multiple people if you only have one clinician. But it is possible, and I would recommend talking with leadership, but also looking at your EMR to see consistently what is being done, what is being ordered. Are there standard of care guidelines that might be available to help support decision making? And again, this is not intended to change how clinicians care for their patients. It's really more with the mindset of what are the things that are ordered as part of standard of care when a patient is not on a research study, so that we can support asking for insurance to pay for a particular activity, because we can show at our institution this is the standard of care when a research study does not exist. These are the things that we would traditionally do. Next. So when is coverage analysis required? Well, next. It will be up to your institution on how they may choose to apply this. However, I would fall back on this as a guidance that it is required for all clinical trials in which tests, procedures, and interventions associated with a clinical trial are invoiced to a third-party payer. If that statement is true for your research study or for your activity that you are planning, then a Medicare coverage analysis is required. Medicare will not cover costs that are paid for by the sponsor, that are promised free in the informed consent, that are not ordinarily covered by Medicare, or that are solely to determine the trial eligibility or for data collection or analysis. So let me go back and review that again, because this is extremely important when you're looking at coverage analysis and when it would absolutely always be applicable. Coverage analysis is always required when a clinical trial includes tests, procedures, or interventions that will be invoiced to a third-party payer. Your institution may choose to include all research studies that every research study that comes in, that for billing compliance and for risk mitigation, that every single research study will go through coverage analysis, and that is fine. And that's actually a very appropriate and consistent and safe way to approach coverage analysis. But it will always be required if that clinical trial will include aspects that are going to be invoiced to a third-party payer. So I really want to make sure that that message gets driven home, that coverage analysis can be chosen to not be performed in other circumstances, but if there is any opportunity or any activity, any aspect of the research study that would have an activity that would be invoiced to a third-party payer, then coverage analysis would be required. Next. So what are the items that are most essential when you're performing the coverage analysis activity? Every institution may choose to approach this slightly differently, but these are the key items that when you're performing coverage analysis, if you do not have these basic items, then you would not be able to perform a full coverage analysis and truly be able to mitigate the risk of billing compliance. So it really is important to make sure that you are working off of the final protocol. And as part of that protocol, you would be looking at the schedule of events as well as the verbiage that is included for describing the activities that are expected to occur as part of that research study. So what I have found is that oftentimes you have this beautiful table that details what research activities will occur on the schedule of events, and that you find a greater level of detail explaining what those activities will entail, or what is being expected of both the research team as well as the sponsor. And it tends to detail that more fully in the verbiage that is included within the protocol that's detailing each of those activities. The next document that you would need to have is the informed consent. That document will detail what's being explained to the patient and their family regarding what the expectations are for their participation. Obviously, it will review the eligibility criteria. The protocol would detail that to the study team in a little bit more specificity. But it will also detail the items that the sponsor is expecting to cover, where they may have some level of expectation for insurance to cover certain items. And that helps to really shine a light or elucidate where the sponsor is wanting to provide either equipment or coverage of services or activities, and what they are hoping would be able to be billed to patient insurance. The clinical trial agreement also tends to have language in there. I typically will look first at what is the subject injury language to determine what the thought process might be behind that particular clinical trial. And then the budget template for our study team can be very important too, in helping to sort of suss out where the sponsor is expecting to cover a particular item, or where the patient insurance might need to be covering a particular item. And more often than not, at least within pediatrics, the majority of the budgets that we get are either going to be a sponsor pay all, where the expectation is that this would not be billed to patient insurance, and the sponsor is going to cover all the research-related activities. There are some situations where it might be a mixed billing, where the sponsor will pay for most of the research-related activities, but they would prefer that a full coverage analysis be performed to see where we may have some leeway, or where we may be able to partner with patient or third-party payer, patient insurance or third-party payer situations. Or there may be an opportunity for us to perform a coverage analysis and develop that study budget along with the sponsor to be able to identify what aspects need to be covered by the research and what aspects would be able to be billed to patient insurance. And then the other aspect of all of this is the sources for supporting the coverage analysis billing designations. And so that is going to be the various resources to include your national coverage decision and other resources that you use at your institution, again, following a very prescribed series of steps to ensure that there's consistency, that there is clarity, and that there is an agreed upon billing plan for ensuring mitigation of billing risk. Next. So as I had stated, there are some very wonderful resources that are provided, and it is important to understand the nuance and the differences between these. They're listed here in a very specific order because more often than not, this is the order that we would be expected to review. So when you're performing your coverage analysis and you've determined that this is a Medicare qualifying clinical trial, that it does have therapeutic intent, and that the therapeutic intervention is going to enroll patients who are with a diagnosed disease, then you would want to go in and look at what are the allowances, what are the benefit categories, does this study meet the qualifications and additional characteristics that Medicare states must be met. And if all of those things are true, then the first place you would want to go is to your national coverage determinations. That's going to be the very overarching across the entire US. This is what the rules are, and this is the level of frequency that a particular activity can occur, or it may even state under what circumstances a particular activity or item can be billed to patient insurance. There are definitely limitations. For example, an ECG can only be billed to patient insurance if there are symptoms. So signs and symptoms is one of the criteria to be able to bill to insurance. And so if you had an ECG as part of a screening visit, in that example, that ECG would not be able to be billed to patient insurance because typically you don't want signs or symptoms that are cardiac related as part of your screening visit. At least traditionally, that would not be the expectation. And so those are the ways in which you could utilize your documentation to be able to state, under these circumstances, this particular activity can be billed to patient insurance, but if this circumstance has not occurred, then it needs to be billed to the study. What's interesting is that your local coverage determinations, so each state and geography will have a local coverage determination, and it really is important to make sure you know who your Medicare providers are in your area and what the local coverage determination websites would be, so that you can look at what might be even more restrictive, or it might be more broad in the application. And what's really interesting is that the local coverage determinations actually supersede the national coverage determinations. And so you do need to look at those two things in concert. It's not often that the local coverage determinations are lengthy. They're often fairly short and condensed, but it is important to make sure that you're looking first at the national coverage determinations and then following that up to see if this particular procedure or activity or item is referenced in the local coverage determination, because it could be more broad in the application, or it could be more restrictive, or it could completely eliminate your ability to be able to bill that activity to insurance. And so for sponsors, that can be challenging because they may be looking at the national coverage decision and say, look at this can be billed each and every time. But then based on the geography of the local coverage determination, it could be potentially more restricted in that area. In the absence of an NCD or an LCD determination, professional medical association guidance can be used to help establish routine costs. And I find this actually to be the most helpful when it comes to pediatrics, in particular pediatric rare diseases. There's not often a lot of information out there to support specifically within the NCD or the LCD. And so as long as they're not listed as excluded, there are opportunities to be able to provide appropriate documentation to support routine costs or even standard of care costs when you are able to back that up with professional medical association guidance or even nationally recognized peer-reviewed publications. And so those are two places that, again, for pediatric rare disease, those tend to be some of the places that at least I go to when I'm wanting to help clinicians be able to establish or justify certain activities being billed as standard of care, or in this case as routine care. And so that can be a place where we could really band together through IACT if there are certain rare disease, I don't want to say conglomerates, but rare disease cohorts or consortiums, that this is a location in which we could really band together and help create some library or be able to really resource together to be able to help provide perhaps better coverage to insurance companies, better documentation for coverage to insurance companies related to standard of care or routine care costs. Next. So the steps to begin when looking at coverage analysis, you really have to start with, does this study qualify as a Medicare qualifying clinical trial? And if the answer to that question is no, and it doesn't meet those 3 criteria that we discussed at the beginning, and I will be reviewing those again, but if it doesn't show therapeutic intent, if it is not for a specific disease area, then a full coverage analysis is not needed. Now I say that, but you do need to make sure that you are following your institutional policies. And so if your institutional policy says that for every single research study, we will always perform coverage analysis, then please defer to your institutional policies. At our institution, that is the case. It's just short. So we do perform coverage analysis on every single one of our studies because we want that consistency. But there are times where I can tell the coverage analysis team up front that I've already looked at the Medicare qualifying clinical trial. It does not meet those definitions. Therefore, this should be an abbreviated coverage analysis review. Or I will submit a billing plan to say, this is the conversation that I've been having with the sponsor. It does meet the qualifications as a Medicare qualifying clinical trial. Here are the documentation to support that. Here are the rationale and the documentation for where we are finding this information in the NCD or the LCD or in the other documentation that we may have, especially if it's for rare disease. I'm more often than not relying on professional medical association guidance or nationally recognized peer-reviewed publications. And if that is the case, then they will continue and they will go through and they will actually look at what are the activities that are being expected. So they'll review the study protocol in concert with the informed consent, the contract, and the budget, and they will go behind me to make sure that the billing designations that we expect as a study team are truly upheld, that it really does fall in line with the NCD and the LCD and any other professional guidance that we were able to provide, that based on our institutional policies and procedures, that it falls in line with what would be expected for a routine cost or for standard of care. And would it be justifiable and allowable based on our institutional policies and then also the Medicare allowed costs? When we're looking at the actual steps, we do want to document those study-related activities or items that are considered routine costs. I often will take the study budget and I will make notes in the margins for my coverage analysis team. And that allows them to be able to follow along with the conversation that I've been having with the sponsor or with the PI or the guidance and documentation that I'm finding within the coverage analysis process to support the decision making. And if there are items, so I know I'm skipping to number 4, but if there are items that are not reimbursable by Medicare or private insurance, then I do make sure to identify how those items are going to be handled. Will it be paid for by the sponsor? Is it being paid for through some other funding source? Is it being provided free of charge? Is there a potential conflict between what the protocol is saying is an activity versus what the budget is saying that it will cover, and then the verbiage within the informed consent? And so having the ability to review all of those documents side by side allows us to be sure, or at least to the best of our human ability, to be sure that we have consistency, that there is documentation to show our decision making, and that we're doing our decision making in alignment with what is allowable based on Medicare and third-party reimbursable activities. Next. So things to consider. I document. I cannot tell you how important documentation is. Just as within our medical record, if it isn't documented, it did not occur. The same thing is true with your coverage analysis and your billing plan development. If it is not documented, then you have nothing to go back or fall back on when the insurance company denies a claim, or when Medicare says, I'm sorry, this is not allowable. Or if you have to go through an audit and you want to be able to show the decision making or the rationale behind how a particular activity was being billed to Medicare and why that decision was made. So when performing coverage analysis, it's extremely important to provide the source or reference to support the billing designation. It is appropriate to utilize multiple sources when looking at trying to justify or make determinations, but it is also important to remember the order of importance when looking at those. So your national coverage decision is going to come first. Then you do need to look at your local coverage decision. If your local coverage decision happens to be more restrictive, or it happens to be more liberal in its application of a particular allowance, then that would supersede your national coverage decision. If both the national coverage decision and the local coverage decision appear to be silent on the issue, or they do not elaborate, then it would be appropriate to look at the literature, to look at other opportunities to be able to support standard of care and be able to document and show justification for inclusion of a particular activity as billable to patient insurance. And it's very, very, very helpful. I will say this again. It's extremely helpful to have those nationally recognized publications. They do have to be peer reviewed. I typically would recommend that you would go to PubMed in order to be able to search those. And if you have a different preferred resource, then by all means use that. And that even professional medical associations can also provide guidance. And when it comes to rare disease and pediatrics, that's often the location where you may find something that might be more specific. And it certainly helps the clinicians when making decisions regarding standard of care. And even outside of performing coverage analysis, having this information can actually be helpful to your billing cycles and your revenue. Because if you have this documentation, even if it's outside of a research study, but you have the documentation, then your billing and claims departments can use this to be able to help ensure more consistency in the recovery of funds, as well as help ensure that insurance will not deny the first time. And so from a billing revenue cycle perspective, this can actually be very, very helpful outside of the research to have this documentation to be able to support insurance claims. Next. So just in review, I want to be mindful of time. Our learning objectives today were to review the history of coverage analysis, to define coverage analysis, to define a Medicare qualifying clinical trial and routine costs, to describe the process of coverage analysis, and also to review considerations when performing coverage analysis at your institution. These slides will be made available. I know Kim will have some better direction on how they will be made available. Within each of the slides, there is additional commentary within the notes to be able to help support the information that has been presented today, but also to help guide if you would like a little bit more information or context in regards to coverage analysis and some of the topics or activities that were discussed. Next. Here are some references and resources. These are all hyperlinked. And so I did want to make sure that you had the ability to be able to find the national coverage decision and the federal clinical trials policy. That would be your NCD 310.1, and that is available on the CMS website. However, you want to make sure you have that bookmarked for yourselves, and at each of your institutions you may handle that process a little bit differently as far as how you approach the topic of coverage analysis and the procedures that you may encounter. There is some really nice guidance. I just picked a handful of different publications, blogs, websites that might have some additional resource that could be potentially helpful. Clinical research versus medical treatment, standard of care versus routine care, Medicare clinical trial policies, the two bookends for the national coverage decision and the Medicare clinical trial policies are federal websites, and then the others are just different blogs or postings that I found to be very helpful in being able to explain some of the information that I presented here today. Next. So I do want to allow just a few minutes at least for questions if there should be any. Fane or Kim, are you able to see what question?
I am. So we have one question. Should the basis, well, we have a couple, but I'll take number one. Should the basis of coverage analysis be framed differently? Not what can be billed to Medicare, but rather what should be billed to Medicare?
That is actually an excellent question. I think that is probably best handled at your institutional level. I know that here at the University of Florida, we've actually had quite a lot of discussion around this, and I'm going to pick on two probably three very specific examples. And the first would be with, it is allowable for us to potentially bill for a pregnancy test. But when we began to really look at the behaviors of our clinicians and how consistently were they ordering pregnancy tests in all situations before starting a new drug, it was not consistent. And it was certainly varied and was differential based on the disease area or the diagnosis. And so for us, we have actually made the decision that it's a very easy place for us to be audited on. And if you open the door just a tiny crack, that's a great way for them to be able to come in and review all of your books. And so we have institutionally made a more restricted policy where we will traditionally, if it's cancer treatments, we will allow a pregnancy test to be billed to patient insurance because it is standard practice, standard of care. For you to start chemo, you need to have a negative pregnancy test. But in other rare diseases or in other disease groups, that may not routinely be the case. And so depending on the disease area, it may be that we have uniformly stated that if it's a pregnancy test, it will always be billed to it will always be billed to the study, because we cannot demonstrate that every single time it's always billed to patient insurance or that the activity occurs consistently enough for us to make that determination. So that is a great or a very simple example, at least, of where we could bill to patient insurance, but we are choosing not to because we can't demonstrate that across all of our disease groups or units that we are routinely engaging in that activity that way when a patient is not on a research study. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, and the other were just a couple of comments. So that was the only question that we had. If you have further questions, you can either send them to myself or Rebecca. Her contact information is here. And I will also be providing the slide deck and a recording of this webinar on our site portal. I will let everybody know when it's available on the portal. You will be getting an email, and you will also be getting a survey at the end of this webinar. If you could please complete the survey, it would be very helpful for us for future webinars. Again, I would like to thank Rebecca for a great webinar and educational series about coverage analysis. This was tremendous, and I found it very helpful. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. And I hope everybody has a great day. And thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.